to this week's episode of Being Human. I'm back with Tom van der Lubbe. He's the lead link at Visi in the Netherlands, a mortgage brokerage that runs the radical business operating system Holacracy, which empowers individuals within companies in a very different way to what we're used to for those of us who work in corporate environments. We did this interview as part of the Forward Management Conference, which is under the auspices of the Management 3.0 community. We get into his backstory, his early experiences, near-death experiences that drove him to build businesses in this way. And we get into the practicality, the nuts and bolts of how do you make these models work with highly decentralized management and this empowerment of the individual to the extent that they do it within Visi. So very practical, very inspiring. Hope you enjoy it. I'll cut to the recording now.
I'm delighted to be here and really looking forward to this conversation with Tom. So remember, we will die. That's the theme. And Tom, I want to ground this conversation in you as an individual, and we'll fan out into your work as a pioneer for Holacracy, the work you're doing with Visi. But to start with, if we know we're going to die, for you, given this one life that you have, what are you moving towards and what are you moving away from in your life? Let's start there.
That's probably the decisive question, huh? The why question, or the raison d'être question. I think in general, if you ask people who are pretty close to leaving this world, it's all about connecting to others. So it's about being human. Your podcast is also called Being Human. So I think that's the core. And to put it more practically, I think if you leave this world, you should have a kind of belief of that you left the world a little bit better than you found it when you started on this planet. So I think that's where we are moving to. And the earlier you have a kind of clarity about that, the easier life becomes.
Right. And when did this realization form for you in your mind? Like, where did that start as a personal journey for you?
I think it's a mixture, but it always has to do with in what kind of circumstances or in what kind of family you were raised or your education. So I was on a Jesuit college. I've a let's say a very a kind of upraising about values, which always were very important. So it was not about being successful, but about being human towards others, care about people who are much more vulnerable. That was a kind of obligation. But I think the decisive thing in my life, and that's I probably also in this chat together with you, is that I was very lucky, and I really say very lucky, that I had cancer when I was 20. That's already 30 years ago. And I survived it. So I had a chance of surviving it with 20%. And that's something I didn't speak about for a long time, because that's something you keep in a kind of secret box. It's very private. So you'd only talk about professional stuff and about leadership. And then the more I started to talk about purpose, or also was interviewed about purpose also by you, that in the end, and if you dive deeper into this topic, always people said, yeah, where does it come from? Where does it thrive come from? And that's, I think, what you often see is that people who have a very purposeful agenda, that in the end there is a kind of biographical context. And in my life, it has been cancer with 20 and surviving it. And then afterwards, life is very easy, because you just don't care about what people think about you, or your kind of goals in your life have changed. So this is probably the decisive moment in my life.
Right. And was there a moment within that, was it that you're suffering with cancer? Was there a specific pivotal moment that you can recall that had you have this shift?
I really realized it is kind of extreme clarity. So I was in the hospital, and I just knew that there was a chance of not surviving it or surviving it. So it's very black and white. It's 0 to 0 or 1. and this kind of extreme way probably normally is not there. But you also see it, for instance, people who survive concentration camps. So if you see Viktor Frankl, and you can name a lot of other people, I find it very interesting that often, or Peter Drucker, people who fled for the Nazis in the 30s, etc. So this whole layer of people who were active in science, for instance, in America in the 50s, or Hannah Arendt, and you can go on and on. There's always this kind of the very decisive idea of I cannot survive it, or I can survive it, and if I survive it, if you take, for instance, Viktor Frankl, then I have to contribute something to this world to make it a better place.
Right. So that covers the contribution. And what about this connection? You know, how does this value that you have on connecting to others, where does that get its genesis?
I think, I mean, I'm a historian, so I'm not a typical entrepreneur with a financial background being active in the financial industry. I mean, we do mortgage advice, so that's something. I mean, I'm not a professor for ethics or something like that. No, and I'm an entrepreneur building a company, and we do mortgage advice. So that's very practical, so to say. That's not very philosophical. But I think it always starts with religion or philosophy and this kind of reflection. So and that's also, but also if you take this book of this Australian nurse who wrote about caring for people who would die, and then asking them what has been important in your life, it's always about connecting. So I think that it doesn't matter where on the world or in what kind of discipline, it's always about connecting. It's always about caring for others, and our, let's say, way of behaving in business, that's the exception. That's the exception to the rule. And the example I always like to take is that if you have cake and you're sitting somewhere in the world with somebody else, and you let's say we would sit on the table and we have a cake, and we would say, okay, you get the half and I get the half, and I take the knife and just take two parts, then it will be equal parts, more or less. And this let's say game, or this example works everywhere in the world. It doesn't matter what context. But if you would take 80% or 90% of the cake and I would give you 10, then you would say, hey, what's going on? And you can also see this on experience with apes. And so there this very strong belief of, let's say, what's correct, or you also see it in language. If you talk about altruism and egoism, then the way we behave in business is just egoistic, which is not the norm, which is not normal. And you can talk about it in very difficult, let's say, ways, and you can call it shareholder value capitalism, and you can talk about profits, etc. But in the end, it's about the core of things, and then the rest of society behaves in a different way. It's always about caring others.
Right. No, I get the intuition there. If I was to play devil's advocate, you know, a capitalist might say, well, if we can make a bigger cake, even if we end up with inequality, more people get more cake because we've grown the size of the pie, and that's how capitalism works.
Yeah, but and that's exactly. But also from scientific, let's say, point of view, it's just not correct. So let's say the more inequality you have, the more it harms the size of your cake. So which also very understandable, because the more you have a higher middle class and also less inequality, the more purchasing power you have. So it's very simple. If you would have all the money or all the wealth, let's say for 2 or 3 people, they just can't buy all the stuff the middle class and the whole society can buy. So it's just not true. But by framing this and saying it's a little bit like this whole triple down economy theory, that's nice, but it's just not correct. But if you repeat it all the time, then perhaps people think it's correct, but it's just not the case.
Right. And And taking these principles into Visi, or the mortgage advice company that you of which you're the lead link, am I right? Is that the
Yeah,
right?
I will pass it at the end of the year to the next one, but primus inter pares, but that's another topic. Yes.
Yes, primus inter pares means you rotate. The lead link role. So give us some examples of how you take these principles of connecting to others, caring, contribution into your work with Visi.
Yeah, it starts with a very simple rule. We have only one rule, the so-called golden rule, which just means treat other people like you wanted to be treated yourself. And then you can also dive into that much deeper and see it from a philosophical way. But what I find very interesting is that it is the basic rule in all the religions, doesn't matter where in the world. And that's the example of the cake again. So if you would sit on the other side of the table, you also wouldn't like to have only 10% of the cake. You also would have like to have the half of it. So, and that's one rule. We don't have handbooks. We don't have big rules on the wall. Nobody uses. Then afterwards, like you have in a lot of big corporations, and that works pretty well. So it works in all the directions. It works towards colleagues in the company itself internally. It works towards clients. How would I like to be treated as a client? And if something goes wrong, how would I like to have this solved as a client? It works towards suppliers. Do I try to cut the prices year after year until somebody is not able to survive anymore? It's towards society. How do I behave as a responsible company towards society, paying taxes, etc. Keeping my people on board during times of crisis and not lay them off. Towards the environment, if you talk about this whole sustainability way of thinking. So it's a pretty simple rule which always works.
Right. And how do you? So you don't have this on the walls. There's no posters. How does this get communicated and sort of adopted by the culture? Like how does that permeate?
It's I would just say like it works everywhere in society, or you just ask somebody. So the first thing is that everybody has a very clear understanding of what is right and wrong. I already mentioned the cake example or the apes, etc. Frans van der Waal, a Dutch scientist who did a lot of. It's very funny to watch these videos. So apes have a very good understanding of what's fair and not fair. Perhaps you know these videos. So it's always interesting that if you behave in a normal way, which everybody understands automatically, that you have to explain why you behave in a normal way. I would always say, let all those companies just explain them why they are not behaving in a normal way.
Right. So it sounds to me then it's simply by you and presumably the others around you who formed the company behaving in a normal way, as you describe it, that's been enough. There's no enforcement required in order to achieve this culture.
No, it's not. But it's also, if you even talk, let's say, on the private level to people behaving not in a normal way. For instance, just take an example. You have a company at the moment during COVID crisis, which lays off an enormous amount of people. But you have, let's say, an enormous amount of wealth. Then nobody understands why you would lay off people if you have earned an enormous amount of profits in the past. And those people, they would even say, you're right, but I am not the owner of the company. I am the manager, and I'm told by the shareholders, between brackets, who keep their shares, let's say for 3 months, let's say on average, I am just asked or told to lay off those people because we have to, let's say, do something for our stock price. But everybody understands that it's not fair. So people would just they wouldn't tell other people that it's not correct. They would just say, I understand what you're saying, but I am just in this environment where I'm not able to behave like I would like to do.
Right. So they would suggest, they would claim that they were victims of a system. And is it true then that you've managed to create a system which doesn't experience the same pressures with Visi?
Pardon, you just have to repeat it.
Yeah. So the example you gave of the manager, let's say the CEO with a stack of millions, laying off his staff, and he says to his staff, well, I can't share any of my wealth to get us through this crisis because my shareholders won't let me, right? Because we need to be laying off staff to in service of maintaining the share price, let's say.
Yeah, that's right.
So we might then say that CEO is a victim of this system that they're in. And actually, whilst they have all this altruistic intention, they can't follow through on what they believe is the right thing to do because they're prescribed from doing that by the system. So is there something that you've created in the system of Visi that eliminates those pressures?
Yeah, but let's say we're not an exception. So let's say all those companies, small, medium-sized enterprises, which are owned by, let's say, the people themselves or family-owned businesses, they just behave in a normal way. But if you read the newspapers, but it's also the same for other topics, we have the impression that the world, let's say, exists of a few corporations which are stock listed and they behave not in a correct way, and that's what it makes very difficult. So, but let's say people would let's say if they would be able to choose for themselves, they would always say, people who working in the stock listed companies, that it has an severe damage on the culture, because you have a very short-term oriented focus, which is just not good, and it's even not good for your shareholders, which is also very interesting. It's a little bit counterintuitive. You would say, okay, the faster you lay off people, the better it is, and in a few situations it even might be, if you have a pub at the moment or a restaurant and you're not able or allowed to open it. But in general, when companies don't have the necessity of doing so because they still earning money, then it's counterproductive. Also done a lot of research on that. It's counterproductive for their share price. So, and that's very interesting, but it has to do with the fact that those shareholders are not in for the long run. So they try to optimize for the next 3 months, and then they move on to the next company. And that just creates different interests which are contrary to each other. So the interest of somebody who's working in a company or the environment is long term, and somebody who's owning shares for 3 months, that's short term interest, and the one who's owning the shares for 3 months is not interested in the long term perspective of the company. So
Right.
the problem is embedded in the system, so to say. Yeah.
And you're outside of that system. You don't have public shareholders. You're owned. You have the company's owned.
Yeah.
In the way that you don't. So you've not engaged in that system. And that sounds like that's a really important point here. That to achieve the kind of culture that you've got, it's perhaps much harder, or maybe even impossible, to do that if you're part of, I suppose, the mainstream capitalistic structures for large companies.
Yeah, although let's say in the past it always has been like we are doing it. So it's that's the historical frame. It's there again. We are not the exception. It's just, let's say, the shareholder value, short-term oriented way of doing business. That's something which really evolved from the 80s on, since Milton Friedman. So it's not that you, let's say, if you just take a few hundred years, it always has been about multi-stakeholder interest, because no system can survive which is not multi-stakeholder oriented. So you always have to take into account interest of all the people or interest engaged. But it's exactly the same with the environment. So if you don't price, or you're not able to price in the negative effects on your environment, at a certain time it will just be over. everybody understands that or starts to understand this, but in an economic context, it's exactly the same. So if you don't treat your suppliers well and they go bankrupt, then you don't have suppliers anymore. If you don't treat your clients well, then you don't have clients anymore. If you don't treat your people well, and they have an other alternative, they have another opportunity, then they will just leave your company. So all systems which want to survive in the long run always have to be stable systems, and stable systems only exist if you take interest into account of all the people involved in this ecosystem.
Right. And it's it's an interesting irony here that we might say that financialism of capitalism that started in the 80s is the cause of so much problems, and you as a financial company are bucking the trend now. But I noticed that we've got 14 minutes left. We've got a bunch of questions, so I wonder if we reserve a bit of time now to hit some of these questions before we close out. So I'm not going to pronounce this person's name. You may well know how to pronounce it. Kjell.
Kjell de Ruiter.
Kjell. Splitting the cake is based on a fairness principle, I understand. However, people do not always believe that a 50-50 split is the fairest, i.e. someone has a bigger family to feed or is in a bad place, or is the one that did the most of the work. How would you deal with a situation where different players have a different perception of fair? So Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, I can give a simple answer and a complex answer. I start with the simple one. The simple answer is just let people discuss, because in the end, the intelligence of the group will, in most cases, have the best solution. So it's not about trying to find the most difficult exception and to discuss that. No, it's the other way around. So the question is, how do you come, let's say, from a kind of basis to a more fair solution for everybody? And it can be, if you talk about salaries, for instance, it can be transparency, or it can be the whole topic of psychological safety. And I would always take that as a starting point, and not trying to focus on the last exception and then saying, for instance, okay, there's somebody who has 4 children and they both work in a call center, and do you think it's fair that if 2 people have exactly the same job and somebody has no children, the other one has 4 children, is it fair that they have the same amount of money taking home? In practical, you sometimes have the discussion about, for instance, holidays, that people say, I have children, I only can have holidays during, let's say, the vacation or the holidays of the children. Is that fair for other people who don't have children, that they always have to stay at the office when children have holidays? And then I would say, let people discuss this, and then they will find a solution.
Right. So trust, really important principle. Trust in the people to resolve these questions from a principle of how do we do this fairly.
Yeah.
Okay, we've covered okay. In order to have a common understanding in community, organization, company, I think we need to have the same values. What are the values of your company, and how do you, I suppose, prove cultural fit, value matching in recruiting?
So about how we solve the cultural fit topic, that is the question. Do I understand correct?
Yeah,
about that everybody has the same values.
Yeah. So what the first question is, what are the values? And especially we've dug into some of that, but are there any that we've missed? And then how do we, how do we get a match when you're recruiting?
Yeah, and that is also simple answer, complex answer. The simple answer is everybody has the same values, and that's, I think, we talked about already. And then let's say from a very practical way, if we recruit, the team itself recruits the colleague, and everybody in the team who talks to the person in this application process has a veto. So that's a very practical answer how it works. And then it means there's a collective responsibility if you hire somebody, So it's not possible to say, Richard, I knew from the start that there wouldn't be a cultural fit with this new colleague, and because of this collective responsibility, then afterwards, and I immediately go to the negative, let's say, example. Then if you find out that there was not a cultural fit, although you thought there was one, then you're going to solve it together because you feel collectively responsible. We never had any problems because the collective responsibility in the first phase will have the outcome that everybody wants to support the new colleague. So if we hire Richard, everybody will be really willing to help Richard to become successful in our company. And if you find out that Richard is not happy in our company, there will this collective responsibility to talk to Richard and say, Richard, we have got the feeling you don't like to give mortgage advice. And to end with a very practical example, because of the fact that we are a great place to work, number one, for the last 2 years, we had last year a situation where we hired people who really wanted to work for, let's say, a nice company or a human company, and they read a lot of articles about how we organize all the stuff and self-organization, etc. And then they found out afterwards that they didn't like to give mortgage advice. Yeah, I mean that's the core of our business. So I mean we can be a great company and you can like self-organization and you can like the golden rule and you can like all the other stuff, but if you don't want to help clients to finance their apartments, then I mean that's also a kind of necessity if you are a consultant. So but then that's also solved. So and then it's always solved pretty fast. So but it's also something which you find in a lot of small medium-sized enterprises, that fluctuation you have always in the beginning because people find out very fast if there is this fit or not. They don't keep people in the company and then bring them to another department, like sometimes happens in corporate companies. No, they just go to somebody and said, okay, and there's one question we always focus on from both sides. With the knowledge I have now, what kind of decision would I take? Would I start in this company again, or would we hire this colleague again? And if the answer would be no, then you should be honest enough to talk to each other and say, with the knowledge I have now, I wouldn't start in this company because I found out I don't like mortgage advice. And it's totally fine. So that's how it's solved. And we never had any problem. But buurtzorg as an example, a lot of people will know this Dutch, let's say, company, healthcare for elderly people, 15,000 people, exactly the same answer. No problems at all, because it's always solved decentralized.
Yeah. And it sounds like we touched on another value there, honesty, honest conversations. That sounds like that's important in Visy. Next question here from Melanie. What do you do to make sure everyone within your organization has the same understanding of normal? Does it come natural for all your people? If not, what do you do to influence them?
It comes naturally. That's what I always say. So it's, if you talk about family, just take an example. If Melanie, if you have a friend who has, let's say, needs support, and she will call you, then you will help her. It's always like that. And also in the COVID crisis, you saw in the beginning people putting telephone numbers on doors in apartments, just saying, if somebody needs help or shall I go to the grocery shop, just call me. So and it was not, dear Richard, you can call me. No, everybody can call me. So this basic understanding of what's right and wrong. That's why I also took these examples of the apes, even Frans de Waal. Perhaps you should put it in the show notes. There is this basic understanding. And the problem is with a lot of people working in situations where you leave this road of what's normal, there people get severe mental problems because they have to behave in a different way, and are disconnected from their values. And if people find this very interesting, then I would say they should listen to your podcast, Being Human, because there are so many examples of coaches explaining how to help these people. But the basic understanding of what's right and wrong, that's why I always say the golden rule is the basic rule in every religion. It's the same everywhere. So you don't have to teach people that.
Yeah. Okay, from Mathis. I love the principles. One thing that is often real hard is the salaries. How did you build up the salary house, decide on pay for certain functions and roles?
Okay. Yeah, that's a broader topic. If people are interested in that, there's a big article on the platform called Corporate Rebels about this, and it's called Don't Punish for Intrinsic Motivation. So if people want to dive into this, or if people want to, they can also Google my name and then salaries, and you find podcasts. I think also one with you, Richard.
We did a particular episode where we really focused on salaries.
I think we did one on salaries. I think 3/4 of an hour. But to give a very short, precise answer is that we work with external benchmarks, just general salary developments. So you start, let's say, with 25 with a university background, and then we have a curve for 40 years, and just take data from the statistical, let's say, organizations, doesn't matter, you have them in every country, and then we just take a curve, and then we say we split it from performance. So there's no link to performance. So the starting point is psychological safety, and somebody starts with a salary and just gets automatically a salary increase every year, and it has nothing to do with the performance. The performance issue is solved horizontally, peer-to-peer, every day in the teams itself, and it works pretty well. And we pay every year more, and we guarantee this, and we pay for loyalty. So we pay and say, Richard, thank you very much that again this year you're willing to come and bring your whole self to our company, and spending much more time with our company than you're spending with your wife or children or friends, because that's what's actually happening, and which we find in a way very normal, but perhaps it's not. So, and that's what we want to reward.
Which again is bringing back how we used to do things, right? You know, rewarding for loyalty was part of how we managed, right, until relatively recently.
So if you, that's also, if you go back to the Middle Ages, or if you go to, let's say, before the industrialization of Taylor, where you said, okay, if you work more, and here's the carrot, and then you get a little bit more, that's also kind of interval, or a certain period of time. And I always say a short period of time, and then people say, yeah, and if I would say 100 years, then people say, no, that's not very short, but it just depends on how long your time frame is. So I would say, if you just take civilization, it always has been in a different way than like we did at the moment, and especially since the 80s, with much more, let's say, bonus oriented culture. There's also done a lot of research on that, and I think in the podcast we talk about Daniel Pink, and we talk about the counter. It's also counterintuitive, but it's counterproductive to pay bonuses. So it's harming your productivity as a team. So if people want to dive into that, just Google for the podcast interview.
Yeah, no, and that is an extraordinary finding from social science, that bonuses destroy productivity for complex work, and yet they're prevalent in our businesses. All right, well, thank you so much, Tom. I know we've got 40 seconds left, so we probably don't really have time to dive into some of these other fantastic questions. Probably just remains to say thank you for your time. Yes, the Corporate Rebels website, there's some great articles by you. Check out the podcast. Perhaps we can put some links out there. Yeah, with you, where we've gone deeper into some of these topics. Tom, thanks once again.
Thank you, Richard.